Take your Bibles, if you would please. Turn to the book of 2 Kings, chapter number 6, the Old Testament. 2 Kings, chapter number 6. The title of the message this morning is The City of Death. The City of Death. Many people don't read their Old Testament. Many people don't like the Old Testament. In part, they say the Old Testament, literally the whole Bible, has no relevance to us today. They would say that about the new. They surely say it about the old. However, I find out that our Bible has much relevance today. The account that we're about to read is 3,000 years old. 3,000 years old. And yet the truth that's being revealed in this Bible passage is just as relevant to us today as it was to those that it was being preached to 3,000 years ago. The message is, flee from the city of death. Flee from the city of death. Just a couple of verses to get us started. 2 Kings chapter 6, look at verse number 24. Verse 24 says, "And it came to pass after this, that Ben-hadad, king of Syria, gathered all of his host and went up and besieged Samaria. There was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it, until an ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver." I want us to notice 3 thoughts from this text today, this text and a few other verses that we'll add to it. Number 1, would you notice what the enemy did? What the enemy did. Now, we've just read 2 verses. You probably have very little understanding of what's taking place here, but let me back it up for you. The enemy here is Syria. And Syria has come to attack the nation of Israel. By this time, Israel is actually 2 nations. Israel as a country got so bad that God decided to separate it into 2 parts to slow down the evil that it was headed towards. So 10 of the tribes up north banded together, and 2 tribes down south banded together. The 10 tribes up north elected their own king, and they went on their evil way. More times than not, they're referred to by the old name, the name Israel. Sometimes they're referred to just by the name of a predominant tribe, Ephraim. And as you're reading through the Old Testament, anytime after the book of Kings, for example, all the reading that you're reading is to these 2 split kingdoms, and sometimes Israel, sometimes Ephraim, northern kingdom. There's a southern kingdom. It goes by the name Judah because Judah was its primary tribe. It was just 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and Judah was a much larger tribe than Benjamin. So Israel's now in 2 parts. Both of them are headed towards evil pretty fast. But this northern kingdom is headed for evil even faster than the southern kingdom. The capital of the northern kingdom is a city by the name of Samaria. And God is so angry with Israel for its rapid descent into sin that He sends an army against it. And that army is Syria. And Syria besieged the capital city, Samaria. And that's what we're reading in 2 Kings chapter number 6. Now understand, the first city that a conquering army comes to conquer is not the capital. They start by knocking off all the smaller cities as they make their trek towards the capital. So a huge part of this northern kingdom has been conquered already, and now they're knocking on the doors of the capital city. And of course, once the capital city falls, literally the whole country falls with it. Things are bad. How bad is it? That verse that just read said that the siege has caused a famine inside this city so severe that a mule's head sold for 80 pieces of silver. I don't know how much the value of a piece of silver is. More than $1, more than a $5 bill, more than a $10. I mean, we're talking about a chunk of silver. If we were to compare it to prices today, it would be a huge amount of money. And yet, just a mule's head was selling for 80 pieces of silver. Somebody says, what were they going to do with it? They were going to eat it. How much meat can you get out of a mule's head? Not very much. How bad was it? It was bad. But let me tell you, you and I don't know the half of it yet. It was even more severe. Let's read just a couple more verses. I'm going to warn you before we read them, it's quite gruesome. Look at what's taking place. Pick up at verse number 28. The king's walking around. Two ladies called to him. Verse 28, and the king said unto her, What aileth thee? And she answered, This woman said unto me, Give thy son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son and did eat him. And I said unto her on the next day, Give thy son that we may eat him. And she hath hid her son. And it came to pass when the king heard the words of the woman that he rent his clothes. And he passed by upon the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth upon his flesh. How bad was it? It was so bad that mothers were eating their own children. You say, Preacher, that's gross beyond comprehension. It is. It ought to teach us something. It ought to teach us just how bad sin can get. How bad can sin get? Pretty awful indeed. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us how long this siege has been ongoing. It doesn't even hint. But I can tell you, it didn't take a single day for this huge capital city to get into this kind of condition. It didn't even take a couple of weeks for this capital city to get in this kind of condition. Probably didn't even take a couple of months. It probably took many months. And historically, sieges have been known to go on for years. Don't know how long this siege has been going on, but it's been going on long enough that people literally are killing one another, cannibalizing one another, and eating skulls, heads, mules' heads, paying the price of 80 pieces of silver per skull. Things are bad. But, let me tell you this. Right now, technically, that city is still a free city. There's an army outside the gates. It's completely surrounded. Been out there for a long period of time. Don't know exactly how long, but technically, the people inside the city are still a free people. If they want to, they could come and go as they please. Anybody in that city could walk through the gates and head right on whatever direction they want to go. Now, as soon as they did, they're going to fall in the hands of their enemy, but they're free. They could do that if they wanted to. They've still got a king. His name is Ahab. We just read about him. He walked along the wall, rent his clothes, had sackcloth on as a result of seeing what was taking place inside of his city. But this king, as powerful as he used to be, can do nothing about the enemy outside the gate. I suppose they still got their own army. Bible never mentions them, but supposedly they still got. I don't know why they're not going out to fight the enemy. Maybe because they judged it to be a hopeless cause before they ever went out there, but they got their own army. This is a city with its own government. They've got their own laws. They've got their own rulers. They've got their own judges. But none of their rulers, none of their judges, none of their laws could help them in this situation. They've even got their own fields. Everybody has fled into the capital city. It's a fort. They've got the gates closed. They've got guards up on the gates. But every person that's inside that city has a garden someplace, maybe a farm, maybe some cattle, maybe some sheep. They've got food someplace, but they can't get to it because they're locked up in this city. It's a city of death. Strange thing is, you and I have a lot more in common with that city than we realize. For example, just like they had an enemy outside their gates, we've got an enemy. Matter of fact, we've got enemies, plural. Let me just introduce a few of them to you. When I tell you who they are, you'll recognize them. Number one, sin is our enemy. Now, sin's not a person. It doesn't have a mind. It doesn't think. Sin is a thing. But quite often we think of sin as if it was a person because sin does us so much damage. Sin hurts us in so many different ways. It's almost like it's a being with a mind that's coming against us, but it's not. Really, sin is a tool. It's a tormenting tool. I don't know how familiar you are with the previous wars we've been in, but I know some of the tortures that they've used in years gone by in some of the battles in some of the countries we fought. Some of the means, none of them pleasant, but I remember reading about the Vietnamese, how they would take and drive bamboo sticks up underneath their victims' fingernails as a means of torture. Not very long ago, we were engaged in war with some of the Saudi Arabian countries, and America was waterboarding some of those that they had captured. Not a pleasant event at all. I have heard of people taking branding irons and literally running them through the flesh, literally running them all the way through the flesh of those that they were tormenting. Now, all of these tormenting tools are the same type of tools that sin is to us. It is the bamboo sticks that's run up on our fingernails. It is that branding iron that pierces our flesh. It is that waterboard that gags us, chokes us, and makes us think we're going to die. Sin is an enemy because of the pain, the suffering that it causes us. First enemy we've got is the enemy of sin. Second enemy we've got is Satan. Now, Satan is a person. He does think. He is the warden of our prison and the executioner of those inside the prison. He's the guy who takes a little bit too much pleasure in his job. As a matter of fact, he's the one who takes a whole lot too much pleasure in his job. He's the brains behind sin. He's the one who spreads it around. He's the one that comes up with all of these attractive things that once we put our hand inside of it, we find out it was a trap, a painful trap, and that it hurts us. He's the mastermind that causes us all the suffering, all the pain, all the heartache, and eventually even all the death. That's Satan. He's our enemy. We've got sin as an enemy. We've got Satan as an enemy. We've got the grave as our enemy. Grave's like a hungry beast walking around the boundary of our life. And he's just waiting for an opportunity to pounce upon us. And it seems like the grave really desires to pounce upon the weak or the sick or sometimes just the foolish and drag it off into its den of death. Make no mistakes. Even the Bible says death is just a footstep away. Just one missing breath away. That's how close death is. It's an enemy that's on our heels. And then there's the biggest enemy of them all, and that's hell. Hell is what leaves death so hungry. You see, every person that dies, every victory that death claims, if that person is lost, hell reaches up and grabs that carcass. And instead of death being able to feast on that lost soul, hell grabs a hold of that carcass and drags it down into the eternal pits of damnation so that death has no satisfaction in it at all. He must turn around and look for a new victim to seek after and to lure into his pit. You and I have enemies far worse than the Syrians. They could be kept at bay. Gates, stone walls, arrows, defenses kept them for a prolonged period of time on the outside of the gates of Samaria. But these four enemies, they come into our lives and trample through at will. And they do exceedingly great damage. Tell you something else we've got in common with these Samaritans. Technically, even though we've got these four enemies, we're still technically free. We go and come as we choose. We have the illusion of freedom, as if we could do whatever we want to do. As a matter of fact, right now, a huge portion of this world that we're living in, they call themselves democracies, and they like to think of themselves as being free. But the truth of the matter is, it's just an illusion. Death is walking around the boundary at all time. Hell just beyond that. Sin is tormenting us. The devil is running around with the keys to this prison that we're in. The truth of the matter is, we're all in the city of death. Oh, we've got kings, we've got presidencies, we've got congresses, we've got laws, we've got police officers, we've got judges, we've got all kinds of things that are supposed to protect us. But the truth of the matter is, against these four enemies, there is no protection at all. The actual truth of the matter is, we, like the Samaritans, are starving to death, thinking we have substance when we really have nothing at all. You say, preacher, you're painting a pretty grim picture. I'm painting a pretty accurate picture. These folks were in the city of death. They had an enemy, and you and I have an enemy, and we likewise are in the city of death. Number one, would you notice what the enemy did? Number two, would you notice what God did? What God did. Now, chapter 6 is quite gloomy. But you look over at chapter number 7 and you find out God did something glorious. He provided a salvation. Look at chapter 7. Pick up reading at verse number 6. 2 Kings 7:6. For the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear a noise of chariots and a noise of horses, even the noise of a great host. And they said one to another, Lo, the king of Israel hath hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us. Wherefore they arose and fled in the twilight and left their tents and their horses and their asses, even the camp as it was, and fled for their life. Now understand, there's a war going on here. A huge army has come up against a fortified city, the capital city of an entire nation. It has surrounded that capital city. It has stayed there so long that people are dying inside that city, that people are killing one another to cannibalize each other inside that city. So much so that a mule's head would sell for 80 pieces of silver. It's a dire situation. And then all of a sudden God shows up. And God brings a glorious salvation. The Bible tells us what He did in these two verses. He causes them to hear a sound. That's all. They didn't see a thing. Probably in the middle of the night, they hear a sound. It sounds like chariots. And then everything else is just their assumption. They assume the king of Israel has hired some armies to come and help them, the Hittites and the Egyptians. And they jump up out of their beds and they grab whatever they've got and off they go. Huge army, thousands, tens of thousands strong. And they get up and they leave. I see what they did, but I got to tell you, I wonder how God did that. How did God produce a sound that sounded like a multitude of chariots? I was listening to one preacher preach. He said, I think God brought the chariots of heaven down. And just not let them be seen, but just let them ride on the clouds up above those Syrians. You know, God's got chariots. He sent one chariot of fire to pick up Elijah. Elijah was swooped up in a chariot of fire. By the way, he's got horses too. The Bible tells us, Revelation 19:11, when Jesus comes back to set up His kingdom, He'll be riding a great white horse. And it tells us His great army that will follow Him will be on horses too. God's got horses. God's got chariots. God could have let His spiritual chariots trample across the sky and let the sound radiate across the valleys. And it scared all the host of the Syrians. God could have done it that way. But even more curious to me than how God did it, I wonder when God did it. You see, we don't know. It could have happened that night. It could have happened that week. It could have happened weeks ago. It could have happened months ago. You say, preacher, why is it important when it happened? You need to understand what's taking place inside this city of death. People are inside this city of death suffering every minute that they're in there. They're dying every minute that they're in there. But get this, God's already brought a salvation to them. They just don't know the salvation God's given to them. This little baby that we just read about, this baby whose mama killed it, boiled it, and then ate it. This little baby may not have had to have died. It could have been the Syrian army was already gone before the mother came up with this idea. People inside this gate are suffering. People inside this city are dying. Literally every day, more and more death. I wonder when God provided the salvation. These Jews inside this city had been so cowed by the Syrian army, they weren't even sending out reconnaissance anymore. They weren't investigating to find out where the army was and how strong the army was and what was taking place in the army camp. They were a defeated, conquered people. Still alive, yes, but for all practical purposes, they were a defeated people. God had provided a salvation, but they didn't know God had provided a salvation. They were suffering and dying, but they didn't need to suffer and die. I keep seeing comparisons between what they're going through and what we're going through. Do you understand? We've got enemies. Do you understand? We too are living in the city of death. But do you understand God has provided for us a salvation? A salvation over all of our enemies, a salvation over our soul itself. God has provided a salvation. Sadly, some people just don't know about it. You say, preacher, what kind of salvation? 2,000 years ago, He sent His Son to die on the cross for our sins. And in so doing, get this, in so doing, He defeated every one of our enemies. He defeated sin. Sin hurled everything at Jesus it could hurl. It tried in every way possible for those 33 years that He walked on this earth to entangle Jesus, to trip Jesus, somehow to get Jesus to do something that was wrong. In the entire 33 years that Jesus was on this planet, He didn't say anything wrong. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't even think anything wrong. And in Jesus wrestling with sins that probably you and I cannot even imagine and overcoming every one of them, He defeated forever the power of sin. But not only did He defeat sin, He defeated the warden of the prison, the executioner, the one who thinks and plans the traps, the tormentor himself. Satan himself had access to Jesus to try in every way that he could to cause Jesus to do something wrong. He did everything he could do to cause Jesus to sin, but not once did He sin. Not once, not ever. And in being victorious, Jesus defeated both sin and Satan. Not only did He defeat sin and Satan, but He defeated death. Death, as the hungry prey, grabbed a hold of Jesus. I think probably grabbed hold of Him in a more vehement, violent way than He's ever grabbed a hold of any person in all of time. And He indeed conquered Jesus. He drug Him down into the very grave itself. And for 3 days and 3 nights, Jesus lay in the grave. But on the third day, He got up. He kicked the devil, sin, and the grave to the curb. And in so doing, He defeated the grave for all those that would put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ forever and ever. Amen. And the greatest of all of our adversaries, hell. Jesus conquered hell by going to the very gates, ripping them off the hinges, going to the face of hell Himself and says, you don't touch any of mine forever and forever. You don't bother them now. You don't bother them tomorrow. You don't bother them ever again. You don't threaten them. You don't breathe on them. You don't molest them. You don't frighten them. You don't do anything. Jesus cowed that hell itself down till it was whimpering and whining. Now the only thing hell ever says to Jesus is, yes, Lord. It's bowed. It's cowered. It's broken. Now hell itself may indeed enslave those that are lost, but it will never lay a hand on those that belong to Jesus. Jesus defeated all 4 of those enemies. Could I tell you, if you'll put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ today, He'll conquer your enemies too. Sin, Satan, hell, and the grave itself. Now, I don't mean to say life's going to be easy for you. The truth of the matter is, we've got one more enemy. And that enemy's a traitor to us. And that enemy sometimes goes over to the devil and makes a treaty with him. Or sometimes goes to sin and invites him to come in. Sometimes even plays with death itself. That enemy's our flesh. Our flesh is a traitor to us. Hey, we're saved. We've been set free. Death has no more dominion over us. Satan can't bother us. Even the grave can't threaten us. Hell itself can't even breathe on us, can't even look towards us. But sometimes this old flesh gets to craving the earthly things, the worldly things. It betrays us. It goes and makes pacts with those that are our enemies. Nothing we can do about that right now, but don't be defeated because, my friend, Jesus isn't finished yet. One of these days, He's going to send out the call, and He's going to call all of His saints out of this earth and out of this body of flesh. He's going to give us a glorified body, and from that point on, the old traitor flesh will have nothing left to betray. From that point on, we'll have glorified bodies, and all of our enemies will be forever defeated. I'm just telling you, God has brought us a great salvation. Number one, would you consider what the enemy has done? Number two, would you consider what God has done? He has wrought a great salvation. Number three and last, would you consider what 4 lepers did? This story is actually about not the condition inside the city of death, not the victory. It's about 4 lepers. Look, if you would, back towards the beginning of the chapter, verse number 3 of chapter number 7, and notice what the lepers did. It says, "And there were 4 leprous men at the entering in of the gate. And they said one to another, 'Why sit we here until we die? If we say we will enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore, come, let us fall into the host of the Syrians. If they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die.'" Notice first what the enemy's done. Notice second what God's done. But notice third what the 4 leprous men did. Number one, they reasoned correctly. Here's 4 leprous men. They're sitting at Samaria's gate. They're sitting at the gate of the city of death. And they realize, number one, if we sit here, we're going to die. Now, understand, leprous people did not live inside the cities during those days. Leprosy was a very contagious disease. So lepers would form a colony outside of the cities in those days. They'd be far enough away where they wouldn't threaten the city, but they'd be close enough where from time to time they might benefit from some of the mercy of the citizens, some food, some help, some shelter, some comfort to them. But now with the Syrians coming, the colony has fled. We don't know where all the lepers are. All we know is there's just 4 left. And these 4 had no place else to go. And so they went to the nearest city, Samaria. And probably they hoped that Samaria would open the gate and let them in. But they found out mercy had shriveled away. And the gates were closed. And now they're sitting outside of those gates. We don't know how long they've been there. They've probably been there as long as the Syrians had besieged the city. They probably packed up and ran when the Syrians were coming, and they've been outside these gates for days, for weeks, for months, maybe for years. What have they been doing outside that city? Living the best they could. Maybe somebody inside the city was throwing them some scraps. Maybe the people, after they ate whatever food they had, would take the trash and throw it over the wall. And I can see these lepers having no other means to support themselves, no crops, no food, sifting through the trash, eating whatever was edible from the garbage. But now they've come to the realization, we can't sit here anymore. We're about to die. Why? There's no food in the city. And if there's no food in the city, there's no scraps coming over the wall. We're going to starve to death. They reasoned correctly. If we sit here, we will die. But not only did they reason correctly about where they were, they reasoned correctly, if we go into the city, we'll die in there. If they could get into the city, number one, they probably can't. The gates are closed. The windows are barred. There's guards up on the wall. They probably could not get in that city no matter what they did. It was fortified to keep people out. Probably couldn't get in no matter what. But if they did, probably the people inside the city would kill them. Why? They're already starving to death inside the city. They're already feasting on mules' heads. They're already eating their own young. 4 more guys show up, what are they going to do? That's just 4 more mouths to feed. What are they going to do? Probably going to kill them. Besides that, not only would it be 4 more mouths, But they'd be bringing in this deadly disease of leprosy, one of the most contagious diseases. That's why lepers couldn't come inside the city to live. They might come inside the city to do something, but even when they came in, they had to be covered from head to toe. Nothing but a little peephole was all that was allowed. And they had to shout as they walked through the streets, unclean, unclean, so that everybody could stand away. No, they could come in the city, but they couldn't live in the city because the disease they had was so contagious. If you're already in a besieged city and somebody like that comes into your gates, what are you apt to do? Logically speaking, 4 more miles, a deadly disease. Let's just kill them and throw their bodies over the wall. More than likely they would have died. But even if the people inside the city didn't kill them, they reasoned correctly. There's no food in there. So even if we go inside and they don't kill us, we're still going to die of starvation. They reasoned correctly. We can't sit here, we'll die. We can't go into the city, we'll die inside the city. And they reasoned correctly. We've got to go someplace else. We can't sit here, we die. We can't go in there, we die. What else is left for us? We'll go turn ourselves into the enemy. They didn't know what was going to happen when they turned themselves into the enemy. They hoped for mercy. They hoped maybe this enemy, seeing that they were Jews, pitiful Jews, starving Jews, sick Jews, would take some pity on them, throw them a few pieces of bread, and at least let them pass through the lines and go find safety someplace else. They didn't know what would happen, but they hoped for the best, and they came to this conclusion. Reasoning correctly, they came to this conclusion: if they kill us, we'll only die. We're going to die here anyway. If we go inside that city, we're going to die there anyway. I mean, the worst they can do is kill us. What did they do? They reasoned correctly. Could I tell you that these 4 men were reasoning better than a lot of people that I've met in this world? They realized, first of all, that where they were going to die. They had nothing to eat. Maybe scraps had been thrown over the wall before, but now they've got nothing, literally nothing. They realized also by going into the city of death, death would simply grip them that much quicker. I've known, I don't know how many people who have lived lives, wasted lives, thinking that they were somehow satisfying themselves on the fruits of sin, only to finally come to the realization life is not satisfying in sin. Life is wasted in sin. And then I watched a good bit of them. Instead of turning and walking away from the city of sin, what they try is to go deeper into sin. They go further into the city of sin itself, and they get more engaged in the sinful activities. And sure enough, sin for a season provides pleasure. But get this, sin never provides satisfaction. Sin never provides nutrients. It never feeds the soul. People that are living in sin are eating air and drinking wind. They have no substance. But how many times do they actually reason correctly and say, I can't sit here any longer. I can't go deeper into sin. I've got to try something else. These 4 men reasoned correctly. Where we're headed is no good. Where we're at is no good. We've got to try something else. Now, for those 4 men, there was only one other direction to go. If we can't go in, we can't stay here, we've got to go some other direction. Any direction they went is going to take them to the same place. The Syrians had formed a circle around that city. There was a barricade. No matter where they went, they're going to fall into the hands of the enemy. It didn't matter whether they went north, south, east, or west. It didn't matter if they put a northeast or a southwest. It didn't matter what direction they went. They're going to hit the enemy. They didn't know what the enemy would do, but they figured out correctly the worst that can happen to us is we're going to die. But I got good news for you. If you're here today and you're lost, you don't have to guess at what direction to go. And you don't have to turn yourself into the hands of the enemy. You can come to Jesus Christ. You can get saved today. And it's not hard and it's not difficult. Jesus Christ was the one who conquered all of your enemies by simply surrendering yourself to Jesus Christ and putting faith and trust in what Jesus Christ did for you on the cross. You can leave here today full, forgiven, satisfied, with a new life, free, and with your enemies defeated. Yeah, you'll still have to battle this old flesh from time to time. You'll still have to pray. You'll still have to keep short sin accounts. You'll still have to get close to the Spirit of God. But I'm telling you, one of these days, even the flesh itself is going to be defeated. You can leave here free today. Those 4 men reasoned correctly. Not only did they reason correctly, but number 2, they found salvation. They found salvation. Now, we've already read what God did. God had taken the enemy and caused them to flee, to scatter. And they left behind everything. That army was thousands strong. Every one of those soldiers had his own tent. Every soldier had his own tent. And every soldier would likely have his own servant. It wasn't just a small pup tent. It was a large tent. Most soldiers would travel with a servant or maybe even with a concubine. And that servant and concubine would take care of his possessions and would take care of his food so that in every tent there would be some wealth. The bounty of what they had taken from others. Gold, silver, jewels, precious stones, changes of clothes. Outside of every tent would literally be a horse or a camel or maybe a donkey or maybe a goat or maybe a lamb. And in addition to all that each individual tent would have, somewhere in that encampment would be the king's tent. The king, he shared his bounty with his soldiers, but he kept about half of everything was taken. You might fool around, going from tent to tent, and there's thousands of tents. There's more tents in this encampment than there are people inside the city of Samaria. You might spend hours going from tent to tent. Me, I'm going to look for the king's tent. I can get more out of the king's tent than you can get from every other tent if you added them all together. Not only can I get more loot, not only can I get more changes of garment, not only can I get more animals, more vegetables, more produce, I could get everything that the king possesses if I find the king's tent. These 4 come into this encampment, and like a child on Christmas morning, they began to gather up what they found and store it here and bury it over there. They were on the verge of death a moment ago. Now they've got food. Now they've got meat. Now they've got vegetables. There's a mess tent somewhere there. Everybody's got food inside their camp. It's a glorious salvation. But now get this. It's been there for who knows how long. And it's been there for anybody to take. 4 lepers locked outside of the gate of Samaria. We've got to go try something different. They didn't know. They had no teacher. They had no guide. They had no preacher to point them the way. We've got to try something different. They're just looking for anything different. And they find the mother lode. They find the camp of salvation. More bounty than any human being could spend in his life. It was the bounty of an entire army with all of its military campaigns. More food than you could ever eat. They found it all. And it's been there for who knows how long. And it's been there for anybody to take. They didn't have to be the one that found it. Anybody from that city could have found it. Anybody passing along the road could have found it. They found the salvation of God. Number 1, they reasoned correctly. Number 2, they found the salvation. Number 3, they shared the salvation they found. Look at one more Bible verse, if you would. Look at verse number 9, 2 Kings 7:9. Then they said one to another, "We do not well. This day is a day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. If we tarry till the morning light, some mischief will come upon us. Now therefore come, that we may go and tell the king's household." These 4 lepers who had been locked outside of the gate of Samaria for who knows how long, on the verge of starvation, can't stay here, we'll die, can't go in there, they'll kill us. We'll go somewhere else. They found salvation, and now they decided they'll share the salvation they found. These 4 lepers, they've got a tender heart. We can't just take all of this. We can't eat and feast, knowing that inside the gates of Samaria there's people dying and they're suffering. We can't just keep all this treasure to ourselves. They were a forgiving people, a tender heart, a forgiving heart. This was the same city that locked them out, that would not let them come inside. This is the city that if the Syrians had attacked, they would have kept the doors shut, and these 4 would have been the very first to have died. And yet, they didn't hold it against those Samaritans. They forgave the Samaritans. Not only did they have a tender heart, they had a forgiving heart. And they had a generous heart. We can't keep all this to ourselves. All this food, all this money, all this wealth. We've got to share it with those inside the gate. The Bible tells us that they started off by hiding. I hope they hid well. Because I'm going to tell you, those people inside the gate, they weren't going to share with them. They weren't sharing before they found out the Syrian army was gone, and they wouldn't be sharing after they found the Syrian army was gone. That's just the kind of people that there are that live in the city of death. Truth of the matter is, if you go and read verse number 17 of that 7th chapter, you'll find out that the citizens inside the Samaritan city trampled to death the guy that opened the gate for them. They were in such a hurry to get to the food that the guy who opened the gate got trampled to death in the crowd. If those 4 lepers didn't go hide something, they were going to be just as hungry when they got finished sharing the good news as they were before they found the good news, because that's the kind of people that they were inside the gates of Samaria. But what a generous heart that they had. That these who had been the outcast, had been given over to death, were desirous to invite those that were their herders to come and partake of the bounty and of the loot and of the food. I'm just telling you, there's 2 kinds of people in this world. There's 2 kinds of people in this world. There's those that are still living in the city of death, and there's those that have found the camp of salvation. And that's the only 2 kinds of people there are in this world. Those still living in the city of death, or those that have found the camp of God's salvation. But there's 2 kinds of people in God's camp of salvation. There's the kind that go and share the salvation that they found, or the kind that keeps to themselves the salvation that they have found. These 4 lepers found God's salvation, and then they shared God's salvation. Question this morning, which one are you? Are you the one in the city of death? Or are you the one in God's camp of salvation? Are you the one sharing the good news of God's salvation? Are you the one keeping to yourself the good news of God's salvation? The story may be 3,000 years old, but the players are still sitting in this sanctuary this morning. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for the opportunity to preach. I thank you for the people to preach to. I pray, God, that you'd accomplish your work, your will in this place this morning. There's some sitting in the city of death this morning. Lord, they're eating the wind. They're drinking the air. Nothing that they do is accomplishing anything. They need to accept Jesus Christ as their Savior. As free as they think they are, their enemies have them in shackles and chains. I pray that souls would be saved today, that lives would be changed. I pray that Christians today would be like the 4 lepers. We don't want to be sick with their disease, but help us to have their heart and share with others the good news of Jesus Christ. Accomplish